People often repeat the phrase, everything happens for a reason. But when life hits hard, brutally, unexpectedly, those words feel hollow, almost cruel. They sound like something distant, something said by people whose worlds haven't collapsed. That was exactly how the young man felt as he wandered into the edge of an ancient forest, his steps slow and uneven, as if his body itself wasn't sure it wanted to go any farther. The morning light was pale, filtered through branches thick with moss. The ground was damp beneath his shoes, soft enough that each step left a faint imprint, as though the earth itself could feel his exhaustion. His clothes were dusty, his hands scraped, and his eyes, tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from something deeper, heavier. Crushed hope. He had come looking for the sage, an old wanderer people spoke about in whispers, saying he appeared only to those in true despair. Whether that was a legend or truth, the young man didn't know. He just knew he had reached the kind of breaking point where you stop questioning myths. Ahead, seated against a large oak with bark darkened by time, the sage lifted his gaze. His eyes were calm, ancient in a way that didn't measure age by years, but by understanding. He watched the young man approach, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet recognition. The young man tried to speak, but his voice faltered. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally let the truth spill out, raw and unpolished. Everything I owned, everything I built, it's gone. He took a shaky breath. Robbers stopped me in the road. They took my money, my bag, my documents, even my shoes at one point. I barely got away with anything. He laughed bitterly. Some people say these things happen for a reason, that something good will come from it. But I don't see how. His eyes filled again, not with the frantic tears of panic, but with the quiet, aching kind you feel when reality finally settles in, and you realize it isn't going to change. The sage didn't rush to answer. He didn't offer a cliché or a soft reassurance. He didn't even shift his position. He simply let the young man breathe, cry, tremble, without judgment. After a long pause, the sage finally spoke, his voice steady like a warm breeze moving through old leaves. "Sit with me." Unsure, the young man lowered himself to the ground. The dirt was cool beneath his hands, and the old oak's shadow wrapped around them like a shelter. For the first time since losing everything, he felt his breathing slow just a little. The sage continued, "You ask why something so painful could possibly be, for the good. But sometimes understanding doesn't come from answers, it comes from stories." The young man looked at him, eyes red. "What do you mean?" The sage rested his hand lightly on the bark beside him, tracing one of its deep grooves, the mark of a storm long since past. "There is a story," he said softly, "about a farmer, a flood, and a loss much like yours. A loss that seemed meaningless, unfair, until time revealed its hidden purpose." The young man didn't fully understand, but something in the sage's tone, something steady and grounded, kept him listening. Perhaps it was the way the forest seemed to quiet around them, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Or maybe it was the unspoken truth in the sage's eyes. You are not the first to feel broken, and you will not remain broken forever. Whatever it was, the young man leaned in slightly, his hands finally still. And under the shade of the old oak, with the forest listening as witness, the sage began to tell the story that would reshape both their lives. Before the sage could continue, a moment of silence settled between them, not an empty silence, but one that made the young man's heartbeat louder in his own ears. And if you feel something stirring inside you already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because this story is just beginning and the next moments might hit even deeper than you expect. The sage took a slow breath, the kind that signaled a shift in the air. "Listen carefully," he said, "because what I'm about to tell you is not simply a tale, it is a mirror." The young man straightened slightly, wiping his face with the back of his hand, trying to reclaim at least a shred of composure. The woods around them seemed to hold still. Even the breeze paused. And then the sage began. "There was once a small rural village," he said, his voice dipping into a register that carried memory and gravity. "A quiet place where life moved with the rhythm of the seasons. And in that village lived a farmer who had just enough to get by. No wealth, no comfort, only the simple pride of providing for his family." The young man blinked slowly, letting the imagery form. He imagined fields, a wooden home, the steady work of hands shaping the soil. "One year," the sage continued, "a devastating flood swept through the village. The kind that comes without warning. The kind that doesn't knock, it takes." The young man's stomach tightened. He knew something about feeling taken from. The river overflowed with such force that it swallowed homes, livestock, crops, everything the farmer's family had stored for the coming months. their grain, their tools, even the little furniture they owned. The sage's eyes softened. The farmer fell to his knees, overwhelmed. His world, his sense of safety, washed away in a single afternoon. The young man closed his eyes briefly. Loss could be loud, or it could be a quiet, suffocating collapse inside your chest. But his son, the sage said, a boy no older than 16, looked at the water and whispered, "Let it go, father. Whatever happened, must have happened for some greater good." The young man frowned. "That's ridiculous," he muttered. "How could anyone say that after losing everything?" "That," the sage replied, "is exactly what the farmer thought." The wind rustled through the leaves overhead, punctuating the moment with a soft shiver of sound. The farmer shouted at his son, anger rising from a place more wounded than cruel. He told the boy to leave him alone. The son, heartbroken, walked away into the evening. And when night came and the boy didn't return, regret settled on the farmer like a heavy blanket. The young man swallowed hard, feeling an echo of that regret somewhere in his ribcage. But what happened next, the sage said, leaning forward slightly, shifted everything. The young man's breath caught. A rescue boat arrived just in time. The villagers helped the farmer and his wife onto the boat. They survived because they were forced outside just before the strongest wave came. The grain, the tools, all of that could be replaced. Their lives could not. The young man stared at the ground. "I still don't see how that makes the suffering good." The sage's voice lowered. "That," he said, "is because you're still standing at the beginning of your own flood." The young man's head lifted. And for the first time he felt it, an uneasy shift inside him, as though something buried was moving, breaking loose, demanding to be faced. This wasn't just a story. It was the moment that would force him to look at everything he had avoided. The moment where nothing could return to the way it was. The young man sat frozen for a moment, trying to process the weight of the sage's words. "You're still standing at the beginning of your own flood." The phrase echoed in his mind like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward, touching places he didn't expect. It unsettled him, not because it was harsh, but because something in it felt painfully true. The sage rose slowly, his cloak brushing against the mossy earth, and motioned for the young man to follow. There was no urgency in the gesture, but there was a kind of inevitability in it, as though whatever came next would happen with or without his readiness. The young man hesitated, then pushed himself up. His legs felt unsteady, as if they'd forgotten how to hold him upright emotionally. Still he followed. As they walked deeper into the forest, the light shifted. The canopy above thickened, turning the sun into narrow beams that pierced through like quiet revelations. The ground was softer here, the air heavier, carrying a faint scent of cedar and damp stone. For a while neither of them spoke. That silence worked on him, not as an emptiness but as a mirror. With each step, memories surfaced uninvited. How he had ignored warnings, how he had rushed through life on autopilot, how he had suppressed feelings he didn't have language for. At one point he whispered, almost to himself, "I wasn't ready to lose everything." The sage didn't slow down. "No one ever is," he replied. "Loss doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives." They reached a narrow clearing where fallen branches created a kind of natural barrier. The sage stepped over them effortlessly, but the young man struggled. A branch snagged the edge of his pants, making him stumble forward. He cursed under his breath and kicked the branch aside, frustration boiling up, the same frustration he'd swallowed for years. The sage stopped ahead and looked back. "You're fighting the wrong thing," he said. "What's that supposed to mean?" the young man asked, breath sharp, eyes tense. "You're angry at the branch," the sage replied, "but not at the choices that led you to this path. You're angry at the world, but not at the parts of yourself that you abandoned." The words landed hard. The young man clenched his jaw. "I didn't abandon myself," he muttered. But even as he said it, his chest tightened, because a part of him knew he wasn't telling the truth. They continued walking until they reached an old, broken wooden fence. It looked like it had been standing there for decades, barely held together by rusted nails and stubbornness. The sage placed a hand on one of the boards. "This fence," he said, "was once strong. It separated lands, kept animals safe, reminded people of boundaries. But over the years, storms weakened it. People leaned against it carelessly. No one maintained it. And eventually it stopped protecting anything." The young man frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" The sage stepped aside so the young man could see the fence from another angle, splintered, weathered, sagging. "You are this fence," the sage said gently. "You kept everyone out, and eventually you kept yourself out too. You forgot to strengthen what protects your heart." You forgot to check which pieces were falling apart. The young man stared at the broken boards. A strange ache spread through his chest, not sharp but hollow, like noticing a wound long ignored. He reached out and touched one of the splintered edges. It crumbled beneath his fingers. "I didn't realize," he whispered. "Most people don't," the sage replied. "Until something breaks so loudly they can no longer pretend." The forest grew quiet again, the air thick with meaning. The young man felt a pressure behind his eyes, but this wasn't panic, it was something deeper, more honest. He stepped back from the fence, inhaling shakily. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" he asked. The sage's expression softened. "You face it," he said simply. "Piece by piece, truth by truth, and you let yourself feel what you buried." The young man lowered his gaze, shoulders trembling slightly. For the first time he wasn't resisting the ache inside him. He was acknowledging it, and that acknowledgement felt like the beginning of something new, something fragile but real. A long breath left his chest. If you, who's listening to this, have ever felt something break inside you, share it in the comments. Your story matters more than you imagine, and someone might need to read your words today. The forest grew eerily still as they walked, as if nature itself sensed the edges of something inevitable. The young man felt it, a subtle tightening in the air, a drop in temperature, a heaviness pressing against his chest. Not danger exactly, but truth. And truth, he was learning, could be far more terrifying. The sage stopped in a small grove, where sunlight pierced through branches like thin golden blades. The light looked sharp enough to cut. Shadows formed rings around them, closing them in as though the forest were drawing a boundary no one could cross. The young man swallowed. "What is this place?" The sage planted his staff into the earth. The sound echoed unusually loud, as though the ground knew something was about to break open. "This," the sage said, "is where you stop running." The young man's heartbeat stumbled. A tremor spread through his arms, not from cold but from the instinct to retreat. But there was nowhere left to retreat to. The sage stepped closer, eyes steady and unshakably clear. "You came to me saying everything was stolen from you," he said. "But what you lost on that road wasn't the beginning. It was the final blow." The young man's breath caught. "You've been losing pieces of yourself for years," the sage continued. "Giving them away, burying them, shutting them down because life demanded you keep moving." The words tore through him. "I didn't," his voice cracked. "I didn't mean to." "I know," the sage said softly. "Nobody means to disappear from themselves." For a moment the young man felt dizzy, like the world had shifted underneath him. He wanted to deny it, to push the words away, but they clung to him with a painful accuracy he could no longer ignore. Then the sage raised his staff and pointed, not at the ground, not at the forest, but directly at the young man's chest. The young man froze. His breath left him in a stunned exhale. "You think the thieves on the road took everything from you?" the sage said, voice tightening with emotional weight. "But the truth is far more difficult." The staff lowered, hovering just above the young man's heart. "They didn't steal your life, because there wasn't much left for them to take." The sentence hit like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he crumpled to the ground as though the truth itself had gravity. His throat closed. He pressed a hand against his chest, a subconscious attempt to hold himself together. The sage knelt in front of H. The forest grew eerily still as they walked, as if nature itself sensed the edges of something inevitable. The young man felt it, a subtle tightening in the air, a drop in temperature, a heaviness pressing against his chest. Not danger exactly, but truth. And truth, he was learning, could be far more terrifying. The sage stopped in a small grove, where sunlight pierced through branches like thin golden blades. The light looked sharp enough to cut. Shadows formed rings around them, closing them in as though the forest were drawing a boundary no one could cross. The young man swallowed. "What is this place?" The sage planted his staff into the earth. The sound echoed unusually loud, as though the ground knew something was about to break open. "This," the sage said, "is where you stop running." The young man's heartbeat stumbled. A tremor spread through his arms, not from cold but from the instinct to retreat. But there was nowhere left to retreat to. The sage stepped closer, eyes steady and unshakably clear. "You came to me saying everything was stolen from you," he said. "But what you lost on that road wasn't the beginning. It was the final blow." The young man's breath caught. "You've been losing pieces of yourself for years," the sage continued. "Giving them away, burying them, shutting them down because life demanded you keep moving." The words tore through him. "I didn't," his voice cracked. "I didn't mean to." "I know," the sage said softly. Nobody means to disappear from themselves. For a moment, the young man felt dizzy, like the world had shifted underneath him. He wanted to deny it, to push the words away, but they clung to him with a painful accuracy he could no longer ignore. Then the sage raised his staff and pointed, not at the ground, not at the forest, but directly at the young man's chest. The young man froze. His breath left him in a stunned exhale. You think the thieves on the road took everything from you? The sage said, voice tightening with emotional weight. But the truth is far more difficult. The staff lowered, hovering just above the young man's heart. They didn't steal your life, because there wasn't much left for them to take. The sentence hit like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he crumpled to the ground as though the truth itself had gravity. Voice no longer gentle, it was honest, raw, uncompromising. You had been living empty, he said. Pretending. Surviving on fragments and calling it a life. Your hope was already cracked. Your identity already fading. Your spirit already exhausted. Tears spilled before the young man could stop them. Not fast but slowly, heavy drops that carried years of unspoken grief. The sage leaned closer. What the thieves took was the illusion, not the truth. The young man shook his head, trembling. So what is the truth? He whispered. The sage looked directly into him. That the real loss, the one you've been afraid to face, was not the robbery on the road, but the moment you abandoned yourself long before that. Silence. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was the silence after glass shatters. After a storm breaks. After truth reaches a place deeper than pain. The young man sobbed, quietly, violently, as if finally releasing everything he had held inside for years. His hands shook against the dirt, grounding himself in the only stability he could find. The sage placed a firm hand on his shoulder. This is the moment you stop dying, he said, and begin living again. The young man lifted his face, streaked with tears, eyes raw but clearer than before. Something had broken open inside him, something he could not put back. And he knew, absolutely, that nothing could ever return to the way it was. If this moment hit you as deeply as it hits him, give this video a like. It tells us you're here, feeling every step of this story with us. The young man stayed on the ground long after the last tear had fallen. Not because he was weak, but because something inside him had shifted so drastically that standing felt almost premature. As if his body needed time to understand what his heart had just lived through. The grove was quiet. Not silent, but quiet in a deeper, calmer way. The kind of quiet that appears only after a storm has finally spent its fury. He drew in a slow breath. It hurt. Not physically, but in the way healing sometimes hurts after long neglect. The sage remained beside him without pressing, without offering hollow comfort. His presence alone was grounding, like a steady flame that expected nothing but honesty. When the young man finally lifted his head, his eyes were red but not with panic. They looked emptied, cleansed even. There was a softness where tension had lived for so long. He wiped his face and attempted to speak, but the words came out in fragments. I didn't know, another breath. I didn't know how much I was holding back. The sage nodded with a mixture of understanding and firmness. Most people don't, he said. Grief doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers until the silence becomes unbearable. The young man looked around the grove. The sunlight had shifted again, warmer this time, or maybe his eyes were simply seeing differently. Colors looked deeper. Shadows less threatening. Even the wind brushing against his arms felt like a reminder of life rather than an intrusion. He slowly got to his feet. His legs trembled, but he stood anyway. The sage rose with him, leaning on his staff. What do I do now? The young man asked, voice quieter, steadier, as though he finally accepted that vulnerability was not weakness. The sage looked at him with something like pride. You walk, he said. Not to escape the past, but to carry the truth with you. Piece by piece. Step by step. The young man nodded. A small, hesitant nod, but a real one. He slipped his hand into his pocket and felt the torn scrap of fabric he had held onto for so long. He pulled it out, letting it unfold in the light. Mud-stained. Faded. Useless really. But it had been his tether to a life he thought he had lost. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a slow exhale, he crouched down and placed it gently on the forest floor, not as a surrender but as a farewell. A symbolic burial of a weight he no longer needed to carry. The sage watched but didn't comment. Some decisions were meant to be witnessed, not judged. As they resumed walking, the forest no longer felt like a place of fear or punishment. It felt open, honest, Each step the young man took was uncertain but no longer paralyzed. The heaviness in his chest hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape, less like a cage, more like a bruise healing from the inside. After a while the path widened. Sunlight poured in fully now, illuminating the edges of their silhouettes. The young man stopped and looked over his shoulder, back at the grove where he had shattered and begun to rebuild. There was no longing to return, only gratitude for what had broken open. The sage spoke quietly. You survived something inside yourself today. Not everyone finds the courage to face that. The young man's throat tightened, but this time the feeling wasn't pain. It was recognition. He nodded again more firmly now. If you, listening to this, felt something shift inside you too. If this part touched a wound you've been carrying quietly, you can support this journey with a super thanks, or by subscribing if you haven't yet. Gestures as simple help us keep telling stories that heal, that ground, that make people feel less alone. The young man inhaled deeply. Then he stepped forward, toward a world he was just beginning to rediscover. Morning found him before he was ready. Not in a dramatic way, no blazing sunrise or triumphant orchestral swell. Just a gentle brightness seeping through the thinning branches, brushing the edges of his world with a quiet patience he hadn't felt in a long time. He sat on a fallen log, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped. His body felt different, not lighter exactly but aligned. As if grief had finally rearranged itself into a shape he could carry without breaking. The sage tended a small fire nearby, humming a tune so soft it blended into the rustle of leaves. It wasn't a melody meant to comfort. It was simply a presence, a reminder that life continues to move even when we pause. The young man watched the smoke rise and dissolve into the air. There had been a time when he believed pain worked the same way, something that could vanish if ignored long enough. Now he knew better. Some things don't disappear. They settle. They transform. They demand to be lived with, not outrun. Do you feel different? The sage asked, not turning his head. The young man took his time. He weighed the question carefully, scanning the quiet inside him. I feel awake, he said finally. Like I've been walking in a storm for so long that I forgot what stillness felt like. The sage smiled at the fire. Stillness is not the absence of struggle. It's the space where you decide who you're going to be after it. The words didn't land as a lesson. They felt more like a doorway, something he could step through slowly in his own time. He looked down at his hands. They no longer trembled. There was a steadiness there, a belonging he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Not since the day everything inside him collapsed. Not since the loss that reshaped the entire landscape of his world. But here today in this quiet clearing, he felt the faint beginnings of something he thought he'd lost forever. Permission. Permission to continue. Permission to feel. Permission to exist without apology. He stood and took a few steps away from the fire. The forest opened gently in front of him, tall, patient, alive. The kind of place that didn't care who you had been yesterday, only who you chose to become next. Behind him, the sage rose slowly, leaning on his staff. You're ready, he said. The young man didn't ask how the sage knew. Some truths don't need explanations. They just are. He walked toward the edge of the clearing. Each step felt intentional, rooted. The world still carried its weight. He could feel it pressing against his ribs, throbbing behind his sternum, but it no longer crushed him. It shaped him. Before stepping onto the path, he paused and looked back. Not with longing, not with fear, but with gratitude for the place that had held his breaking and his mending side by side. Thank you, he whispered, to the sage, to the forest, to whatever force had brought him here instead of letting him disappear into the dark parts of himself. The sage inclined his head as if receiving a sacred offering. When the young man turned again, the trail ahead looked familiar and new all at once. Not a promise of ease, but a promise of continuation. And maybe that was enough. He walks now with the quiet certainty of someone who has touched the edge of himself and returned. Not whole, because wholeness is not the goal, but honest, present, willing. And if you are still here listening, it probably means this journey touched something in you too. Maybe a memory. Maybe a wound. Maybe a silence you've been carrying alone. So let me tell you this, whatever weight you hold, there is a path forward. It won't erase what happened, but it can transform what remains. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Stories like this aren't easy to tell or to hear, but they matter. And you matter. If this story met you where you are, there's another one waiting for you right here on the channel. Maybe it will find you the same way this one did. Maybe it will carry you a little further. You're not alone. And if you want to keep walking with us, the next video is already waiting for you.